Something that comes up on BookTube a lot is the spectrum from mood reader to planner reader, predetermined reading list reader. And I definitely fall more towards the planner side of the spectrum. I think in part that's because I use the library for most of my reading, so I'm at least somewhat at the mercy of what I can get from the library when. But also, I'm a planner in general, and I am learning that I love a little reading project. And my last reading project was reading several books by Han Kang. Han Kang was the first Asian woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature last fall, and since then I've known that I've wanted to take another dive into her work. I read The Vegetarian several years previously, and I wanted to use that as an opportunity to read some more from her. So what I'm going to do first is introduce some background on each of the 3 books that I did read and quickly summarize them each. And then I'm going to talk about my thoughts on them collectively, because I want to talk about what I found consistent and compelling thematically, and then ultimately which of the 3 books I preferred the most. So for this project, the first book I read was The Vegetarian. This is her most famous work, at least in the Anglosphere, and it was the first of her books that was translated into English. This was originally published in Korea in 2007, and it wasn't translated by Deborah Smith and published in English until 2015. Then in 2016, it won the International Booker Prize. The story follows a woman named Young-hye who makes a decision to stop eating meat and the consequences and alienation she experiences related to that decision. The book is told in 3 sections from 3 different perspectives, but Young-hye herself is never the narrator. Instead, we see her entirely through the eyes of her husband, her brother-in-law, and her sister. Like I said, this was a reread for me. It was the only book of hers that I had read previously, and because of that, I was more prepared this time for how allegorical this book is. It is not really about vegetarianism as much as it is about violence and autonomy. It's also about how people react when someone else is behaving in a way that is totally inscrutable to them. We know that Young-hye decides to become vegetarian after experiencing a graphic dream involving butchered animals, but the narrative is told by the people around her and not her. And so it's less about explaining why she makes the choice to stop eating meat, and more so about what this decision exposes in the people around her. The limits of their empathy, the shame they feel in her unwillingness to conform, and the way her decision ripples out and forces others to confront painful realities. I'm glad I reread this for this project because it is interesting to see how she kept expanding on these themes of violence and oppression and personal disconnection in her later works. The next book I read was Human Acts. This book was published in South Korea in 2014 and translated into English in 2016, again by Deborah Smith. This book explores the 1980 Gwangju uprising and the long-tail effects it had on survivors and those who lost loved ones. The uprising began as student-led pro-democracy demonstrations against the government, and those demonstrations were met with violent suppression by the Korean military, including the indiscriminate shooting of both armed and unarmed protesters, as well as bystanders. This book is again told as a sequence of interconnected sections or chapters from different points of view during the uprising and in the aftermath. The first chapter is told from the point of view of a young boy who ultimately died in the conflict in 1980, and the subsequent chapters are told from people who were connected to him in different ways and are dealing or not dealing with their traumatic memories and with state violence long in the aftermath of the original event. For example, one chapter is told from the perspective of an editor in 1985 who is working on a play about the massacre, but the manuscript must be submitted to the government censorship office, and the censors strip it down so severely that basically nothing coherent remains for publication. Another chapter is from a protester in 1990 who was captured and tortured at the conclusion of the uprising, and who is now being interviewed by an academic about his experiences. It's an extremely tragic history that Han Kang is excavating here, and I cried a couple times reading this short book. Ultimately, this book examines the extreme brutality humans are capable of, alongside the extreme kindness and honor that we can extend to one another, and it's grappling with the full spectrum of human acts. And then finally, I read We Do Not Part, which was published in Korean in 2021 and released in English earlier this year in January, with translation done by Lee Ye-won and Paige Ania Morris. Han Kang has described this book as a kind of cousin to Human Acts, and it also focuses on the legacy of a horrific event of state violence in Korean history called the Jeju Massacre. This massacre was another uprising in 1948 prior to the outbreak of the Korean War, involving brutal military suppression against civilians suspected of supporting communism. Government forces killed an estimated tens of thousands of civilians, and this was censored and repressed for decades afterwards. The structure of this book is a little bit different from the other two, though. It is primarily told from the point of view of Kyung-ha, who is a writer who wrote a book about the Gwangju Massacre and is struggling years later with the aftermath of those atrocities and with loneliness and depression when an old friend and colleague named In-son calls her from the hospital. In-son is a documentary filmmaker turned carpenter that Kyung-ha almost collaborated with on an art installation based on a dream that Kyung-ha had, and they talked about turning it into an art installation and filming it. But Kyung-ha thought she called this project off years ago, but it turns out that In-son was still privately working on creating that installation in Jeju, where she lives, and the installation involved cutting tree trunks, and she has severed off 2 of her fingers and had to be flown to Seoul to get the emergency surgery and care she needed to reattach them. Now, In-son asks Kyung-ha for an urgent request to fly to Jeju and take care of In-son's pet bird while she is in the hospital. And this is because In-son lives alone and there's no one else to care for this bird. So Kyung-ha does end up traveling straight to Jeju from the hospital, where she is met with a pretty perilous journey to reach Kyung-ha's rural home in the middle of a frightful snowstorm. At this point, Kyung-ha's mental state is becoming hazier. She can sense an oncoming migraine, which she suffers frequently, and the line between reality and dream becomes more and more blurred until, in the second section of the book, we've really entered the realm of magical realism. Kyung-ha is seeing apparitions, and she's also unearthing In-son's collection of historical records documenting the Jeju Massacre, a collection started by In-son's mother, who was a survivor of this massacre. This book is a lot quieter than the other two. None of these books has a traditional novel structure, but this one feels meditative and less tied to narrative, and it felt in certain places like reading poetry. There's a lot more focus on imagery and motif. We have snow, birds, trees, fingers, blood, all coming up again and again throughout the book. Across all 3 books, Han Kang repeatedly returns to the lasting effects of violence and the expression of trauma. Her characters often can't or won't express their pain, and that silence tends to isolate them or make them hard to understand. Sometimes that silence is self-protective. They're not ready to face what happened, or they don't believe anyone else will really understand. Other times that silence is forced on them through active censorship. This shows up in both Human Acts and We Do Not Part, where the Korean government suppressed information about the Gwangju and Jeju massacres for decades. But it's also there in The Vegetarian on a more personal scale, when Young-hye tries to explain her refusal to eat meat came from a disturbing dream. Her husband dismisses it and lies to others, saying it's for health reasons, because that explanation is for some reason easier to accept. So whether it's state violence or domestic dynamics, Han Kang is exploring the damage that happens when people are silenced and the deeper harm that comes from not being allowed to speak the truth. I found her focus on that element, on how important it is to bear witness and make space for painful stories, to be the most powerful through line across all three books. Connected to this idea of bearing witness and expressing pain, something else that stood out to me is that each of these books features artists, people who are trying in very different ways to process trauma through creative work. In The Vegetarian, the brother-in-law who narrates the second section is a video artist, but rather than using his art to understand or support Young-hye, he exploits her. He projects his own fantasies onto her body and uses her as a kind of object in this video piece, and it's pretty gross. But in Human Acts, as I said, one of the chapters focuses on an editor preparing a play about the Gwangju massacre, and the play is meant to be a way of honoring what happened, but it's also subjected to government censorship, which guts its meaning and its power. And in We Do Not Part, In-seon is a documentary filmmaker who spent years collecting survivor testimonies and historical records about various traumatic events in Korean history. And she is also, as I talked about, working on an art installation inspired by Kyung-ha's dream. And it's that project that leads to her injury where she loses her fingers. I also want to mention that in both Human Acts and We Do Not Part, we also get an author perspective, and we see evidence of depression that she's reckoning with writing down these histories. So in all three books, art is shown as a double-edged sword. It can be a way to hold space for grief and history, but it also comes with emotional, physical, and ethical risks and responsibilities. I don't often read a stack of books from a single author in close proximity like this, but I am glad that I took on this project to read these books together, because while each is individually thought-provoking, seeing how Han Kang has continued to explore similar themes with different subject matter is also really interesting to me, and it makes me want to do more single author deep dives like this. I enjoyed all three of these books. They're all 4 or 5 stars, but if I were to rank them, The Vegetarian would be at the bottom, then We Do Not Part, and Human Acts at the top. The Vegetarian is really symbolic and surreal, which I enjoy, but I did find the first section, the one narrated by Young-hye's husband, was a bit much. He's just so irredeemably awful that it felt cartoonish at times. Weirdly, it reminded me a little bit, just in the cartoonishness, of the villains in Mickey 17. But either way, I bounced off of that first section a bit, and I can see people bouncing off one section or another simply because each section is so different in tone and theme. And then between We Do Not Part and Human Acts, I think this is just a matter of taste. I think I found the first half of We Do Not Part, before it dives into the historical and more dreamlike elements, to be a bit slow and quiet for my tastes. But either way, the prose is gorgeous throughout the book. And Human Acts was just masterfully done, in my opinion. The shifting perspectives enabled this expression of collective grief and endurance that was really powerful and raw, and every chapter felt purposeful. But I do think I will be thinking about all of these books for a long time, and I see why she won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Her writing explores how we remember and process traumatic events, and how violence lingers across generations, and what it means to preserve those memories. If you read Human Acts, or you want to read Human Acts, and you're generally interested in the Gwangju Uprising, and you haven't watched the movie A Taxi Driver yet, I do recommend that movie. It's a film based on a true story of a Seoul taxi driver who became involved with the Gwangju Uprising after driving a German journalist into the city to cover the government crackdown. And it stars Song Kang-ho as the taxi driver, who you may recognize from Parasite. I'd also recommend, as further reading for those interested in modern Korean history, the book Mater 210 by Hwang Sok-young. Something that is touched upon in both Human Acts and We Do Not Part is the role labor unions and their communist ties played in these popular uprisings, and those ties are very deeply described in Mater 210. Mater 210 is a family saga that covers a working class family of rail workers and their involvement with the labor movement in Korea from 1910, when Korea was still occupied by Japan, through Korean liberation and the Korean War through to the modern day. I thought that book was so expansive and informative, and an incredible achievement to thread such a long history together with such detail and emotion. It also contains elements of magical realism through the presence of ghosts or spirits that I also see in Han Kang's work. So that's my deep dive into these 3 books from Han Kang. If you've read any of these or plan to, or if you've read any of her other works, I would love to hear your thoughts. I know The Vegetarian is her most popular work, but it's also one that can be a bit polarizing, so I'm curious to hear people's thoughts about that one in particular. But in any case, thank you for watching, and until next time.